conservative and traditional Protestants in this country have been framed. It's one of the strange features of the modern Protestant church that while it produces many fine Christians, and many fine Christian institutions, whether it be schools or charitable organizations, churches, and the like, it produces surprisingly few public intellectuals and political leaders, at least recently. This striking feature can be seen in something my colleague Aaron Wren and Ben Dunson just now have pointed out, that as a share of conservative voters, the American Protestant church is a majority, or nearly so. Yet the leading voices of that same movement have either been reticent to be involved in politics, as Ben just said, or used their public position to chastise the American Protestant voting public, rather than explain what good those voters might be aiming at or how to go about accomplishing the good that they seek. This situation, I believe, has arisen as a result of a phenomenon that Czesław Miłosz was quite familiar with. When the Soviet Union moved into any new country, they would not actually silence Christians. What they would do is they would try to selectively identify Christians and highlight them, provided that they would be apologists for whatever policy the Soviet regime wanted to put forward. And then simultaneously, they would raise up these voices to kind of encourage Christians to adopt whatever the Soviet policy is, and then they would also selectively choose Christian voices to amplify who were the most extreme and ridiculous opponents of the Soviet regime. Our media environment is not run by Soviet yet, but it is dominated by Roman Catholic conservatives and a prestige publishing operation which is overwhelmingly run by liberals. I have friends in both of these camps. However, in such an environment, it is no wonder that a similar Protestant rope-a-dope strategy can be seen to be operating in America for most of my lifetime. When George W. Bush was asked who his favorite philosopher was, the Yale-educated president of the United States said, Jesus Christ. Now, without trying to downplay the profundity of that statement, or without nuancing the possible rhetorical brilliance, it is quite a distance from a nuanced and thoughtful image of Christianity as it's developed over time, which you can see operating among modern liberals. Barack Obama answered precisely the same question by saying Reinhold Niebuhr, who, whether you agree with him or not, is an example of a contemporary Christian thinker who's doing Christian work. Respected. When modern evangelical Protestants look to their heights for a living voice of theological interpretation, the person that they can probably most easily turn up to is the Christianity Today writer Russell Moore. If you're a liberal and you're trying to do the same thing, you're going to end up reading someone like Marilynne Robinson. Now, I want you to note the difference between those two. Russell Moore, for all of whatever good he's got, he's just a biblicist. Marilynne Robinson has a deep and profound understanding of Calvinism and the implications of Christian doctrine as it works out in human history. Now, you might think Marilynne Robinson is wrong ultimately, but you can't say she hasn't thought it through. You can't say she's uneducated. When presented with those two options, no serious, intelligent Protestant American would want to be a conservative, which is why those who are drawn into politics so often go to Rome, or they make a career out of correcting their own people for being insufficiently liberal, or embracing the frame that has been offered them and beclown themselves. This is a major loss, not only to the church in the United States, but also to our nation. Recovering and deploying the riches of the Protestant tradition has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult, it has been left untried. So I'm going to turn now to try to show some of what we would see if we embark on just such a project of recovery. The American founding was a decidedly Protestant affair. Scholars will point out the deists and even the odd Roman Catholic and Jew who were present, and not only present, but perhaps essential to that project. But even the inclusion of those fellow travelers was the product of the religious toleration which Protestantism established on the European continent, in England, and then expanded through the English Reformation and the Act of Toleration of 1689, and then expanded in the New World to Catholics and Jews as well over time. For further exploration of this and exploration of the law of nations, Brad Littlejohn will be getting up and saying some more, and we can direct some questions that way as well. To see the decidedly Protestant character of the American founding, we have to look at the juridical warrant for the American Revolution. This has always been a murky subject. Some would even say that none was necessary, there being supposedly a natural right to revolution and radical innovation of a social contract. Others look to the common law of England and the ancient rights of Englishmen along the lines of various arguments deployed in the English Civil War and an imagined Anglo-Saxon past. Closely bound up with the question of juridical warrant for revolution is the question of American sovereignty and the status of the law of nations. Judge Holmes famously said, "There is no mystic overlaw to which the United States must bow," by which he seems to have been ruling out not just any sort of natural law with juridical force, but any law of nations in the strong sense whatsoever. If we look closely, it appears the founders did consciously claim juridical warrant for the revolution, and that warrant was not one, but twofold. One was internally vis-a-vis the crown, which was indeed the English common law we tend to think of, but the other externally vis-a-vis the consortium of European Christian nations was the common law of Europe, as articulated by men whom Burke called the jurists of the Christian world, preeminently Emmerich de Vattel. The modern expression we are used to hearing is not the law of nations. The expression we're used to is international law, which, to any Aristotelian, like myself, is a very funny construction. After all, the law is the custom of the people governed by a rational principle and enforced by a sovereign to gain a common good for that people. International law, a law somehow between multiple nations, is naturally absurd. International law is not the same thing as the law of nations. Simply put, the difference lies in the inter. To grasp this, we have to turn to the Treaty of Westphalia, the anniversary of which just passed us on October 24th. Although it is possible that too much importance is accorded to Westphalia as the foundation of the international order obtaining before World War I, nevertheless, I think we're justified in calling the period between 1648 and 1917 the Westphalian order. This order, in all places where it was intact, presupposed the sovereignty of the nation. Their relations were without superior arbiter. There was nobody standing in judgment between the two of them in a human sense. And what bound them together in their relation was simply the ancient principle of pacta sunt servanda, that agreements have to be kept. But although nations were sovereign, this was only true politically, not theologically. God was acknowledged by all those European nations as above the nations in two ways, in his law and in his providence. It was the latter which governed existential conflicts, which is to say, wars between states. And this operated rather like the old idea of a trial by ordeal. But God's law also governed the conduct of wars. For instance, the natural obligation not to kill an enemy combatant who has laid down their arms. We can see fascinating instances of exactly this kind of thinking being deployed in Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he speaks of our own American trial by ordeal and a God judging between us, and an attempt that we have to take quite solemnly and seriously to conduct this war in the most just fashion we can. We can contrast all this with the modern order, where the inter in international law signifies a federation with an attendant quasi-federal center with its own authority. International law is thus, in effect, supranational, fulfilling in part the dream of Kant in his work Perpetual Peace. This work is unsurprisingly a key philosophical work underpinning the European Union. Contra Vattel, who I referred to earlier, this is an image of the relative powers within Europe being balanced in such a way that the local laws and customs of various peoples have to be erased or suppressed. Vattel conceived of the balance of powers as being needful so that no nation grows in strength to such a point where it can enforce its law and custom on any other. It isn't just the term balance of power that has been co-opted and distorted in this way. We can see this by looking at von Mises, who uses the term frame of mind, where Mises wants the whole world to adopt a frame of mind that enforces liberal thinking, that liberates us from all provincial customs. We can read Protestant writers like Thomas Traherne, who argue for a mind in frame which allows for the particularities of the peoples of the earth to flourish as was intended by a good and loving God. The same terms being deployed to profoundly different effect. International law is not the only thing that we see on the world stage. Besides that is the equally strange concept of American exceptionalism. While international law is turned out turned to as sort of a moral code created by man, a natural law which is strangely unnatural. American exceptionalism operates as the power of enforcement of that law, and, of course, of who gets its exception. The U.S. has functioned in recent times as the guarantor of this, and occupying the position of absolute sovereign. These are points I will return to, but for now we note that the U.S. is not merely the lucky inheritor of this new situation. Its policies under the Wilson administration and after in large part created it. But its conception of international order was different and more modest in the beginning. So we'll look now at what we know of the thought of the American rebels regarding international relations. As Eliga Gould has shown, the American rebels were very eager to gain admittance, not into an abstract assortment of the world's nations, but rather into the particular family of European nations. Despite Washington's famous renunciation of the old world, a trope which persists right down to Condoleezza Rice's notorious old Europe jibe, they had a fierce need to be seen as one people here in the Americas, rather than a federation of states. That one people was their admittance to be taken seriously on the world stage. So while they were making appeals to their historical rights as Englishmen to the king, they're seen simultaneously appealing to the other nations of Europe. This is a tricky thing, as there is little to no precedence for the creation of a nation ex nihilo in history. This is a great advantage we have over Aristotle, who in his work, The Politics, laments not being able to find and watch a nation being formed, and yet we have it right here in the United States of America. So the law of nations gets baked into our national DNA from the start. And given the founders, it couldn't have been expected to have happened any other way. We see this evidence through the ages. Take for one more example, two great American jurists of the early and middle 19th century, Kent and Wheaton, both of whom thought that the law of nations was a law of Christian nations. But they seemed to both assume a sort of two kingdoms distinction, whereby Christian nations could find a universal jus gentium, or law of nations, embedded in the laws and customs of all nations. Still, Christian nations had preeminence, not simply by way of power, but by way of juridical clarity and coherence. And together they formed a family of nations distinct among all other nations, but not necessarily in opposition to them. This changes in the period of Wilsonian globalism. Once America emerges on the world stage, ravaged by wars of imperialism, it learns precisely the wrong lesson, that it should itself become an empire. This leads us step by step to the point where we are at now, where the UN and the EU operate as moral authority, a bit like the Pope in the medieval era. And the USA operates as the Roman emperor, wielding the sword to enforce the moral norms where it chooses. There's some discrepancy between these two, as priests and kings vie for power, but all in all, they tend to move in lockstep. This needs not be the case, and a recovery of the Protestant conception of the law of nations and of America as a nation among the nations would do much to heal what can be healed in our own national soul. This healing would do much good for the peoples of the world longing to be free from the strangling of so-called moral norms that the United Nations would like to enforce on all peoples, and for the nations longing to be free of American over-interventionism. It would also do a great deal of good for the American people, I believe, the overwhelming number of whom long to live with peace toward their fellow Americans and long to live as a nation at peace with other nations and with a heritage that they can cherish and pass on to their children. This is possible for us as it was for our ancestors. I open this talk by talking about the ways conservative Protestants have been framed in the institutional ecosystems in which we exist. I end by admitting that some of the blame belongs to ourselves. As Hamburger has written about Protestants who for centuries in this country had public intellectuals and institutions, all their own, when they realized that they were going to have to share this space with the Roman Catholic Church, and to a lesser extent with Jews, they burned many of these institutions down. They removed much of the sacredness of their own institutions. They created the naked public square. Whatever good that might have done, making space for some religious toleration, the flourishing of the sciences, etc., it was not without grave damage to our own national fabric. Richard John Neuhaus was right to resist the naked public square, and more Protestants should follow in his wake. Protestants must desecularize. We must bring Protestant traditions of legal thought, natural law, and civic order back into public conversation. The unipolar world of the past 80 years is crumbling. Nation states are reasserting themselves. We're looking at a multipolar world, and it's time for Protestants to say some things which we haven't been saying since at least the time that my grandfather was a boy in a Methodist church. Some of this work will necessarily be ecumenical in ways we never would have expected, and much of it's going to be historical recovery. In rejecting the frames of Protestants as neoliberal collaborators or goofy backwoods snake handlers, we must assert positive images of nobility, intellect, and self-regard. And in doing such a recovery of our own tradition, we may find that we have lots in common with the thoughts of others. For example, I think here of St. Augustine's Ordo Amoris, and the sense that we have to really think about how we love the world in an orderly fashion. It's not just some universal form of love, but rather, I can't really love my wife by telling her, when I go home tonight, Cheryl, I love all women, You can't love America by telling the American people, I just love nations. You have to be able to think through these things in the sense of particularity. Other places where we might find surprising overlap. For example, the prophetic Protestant social justice tradition, which will overlap in many cases with the Roman Catholic social justice tradition, which they've been doing for much time. Both such traditions offer us resources to resist a vision of secular social justice, which necessarily divorced from God devolves into idolatrous tyranny and oppression. But we cannot get to this place easily. There must be dedicated investment of time, money, and man-hours to fully develop, and in cases update the legal, philosophical, and political thinking of the Protestant tradition. And as we recover it, we will find that it is surprisingly relevant for an age in which the secular, post-World War II global hegemony is over. Thank you.